When we look back at the first century in the Levant, the historical lens usually focuses on the ideological and the theological. We see a world defined by prophets, Roman legions, and the heat of the Judean sun. But if you were a Galilean farmer in the year 30 AD, your primary reality wasn't a sermon. It was a balance sheet. You lived inside one of the most efficient extraction machines ever designed by the ancient world. This was a system where the proximity of a city like Tiberias or Sepphoris didn't mean progress. It meant the mathematical certainty of your family losing its land. To understand the world of Jesus, we have to look past the parables and focus on the silver. We have to follow the flow of the denarius, the tax coins that bridge the gap between a dusty vineyard in Galilee and the marble palaces of Rome. This video is an investigation into the structural inevitability of economic collapse. We are stripping away the religious veneer to expose the cold, hard mechanics of imperial taxation, land consolidation, and the debt foreclosure loop that pushed a nation to the brink of total revolution. By analyzing the data of the Roman census and the operational costs of the Jerusalem temple, we can see that the crisis wasn't a matter of if, but when. This is the story of how a system of subsistence was engineered into a system of extraction. If you find these deep dives into the hidden mechanics of history and infrastructure valuable, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. This helps our algorithm-driven research reach more viewers who want to see the numbers beneath the surface of the past. Stay with me until the final section, because we're going to calculate the exact moment the Galilean middle class ceased to exist, revealing a hidden economic trigger that historical records usually overlook. This final revelation will change how you view the entire socio-political landscape of the period. We aren't just talking about poverty. We are talking about the architectural dismantling of a society's wealth. The economy of Roman Judea was built on a foundation of land. In an agrarian society, land is the only true capital, and for centuries, the Jewish social structure was designed to keep that land distributed among small, family-owned plots. However, the arrival of Roman administrative logic changed the fundamental physics of ownership. Rome did not just want loyalty. It wanted a predictable, liquid stream of revenue to fund its legions and urban expansion. This required the transformation of varied, local agricultural outputs into a standardized currency, silver. When a subsistence economy is forced to interact with a high-velocity imperial economy, the result is always systemic displacement. The debt foreclosure loop became the primary engine of this change. It was a mechanism where the burden of tax, combined with the volatility of harvest cycles, created a vacuum that sucked land away from the many and concentrated it in the hands of the few. We are looking at a mathematical trap where the interest rates on loans, often reaching 50%, made recovery statistically impossible for the average farmer. This framework wasn't accidental. It was the inevitable byproduct of an empire that prioritized the efficiency of extraction over the stability of the producer. To understand why the Galilean farmer was doomed, we must dissect the Roman tax code, which functioned as a multi-layer extraction filter. The first layer was the tributum soli, or land tax. Unlike modern taxes based on profit, the Roman land tax was often a fixed requirement based on the estimated productivity of the soil, not the actual harvest. This meant that in a year of drought or pestilence, the tax obligation remained static. The Roman administration didn't care about the family's caloric needs. It cared about the 10% to 12.5% of the total yield that belonged to the emperor. But the extraction didn't stop at the soil. The second layer was the tributum capitis, a poll tax levied on every individual simply for the privilege of living under Roman rule. To pay these taxes, the farmer needed silver denarii. This created an immediate operational crisis. Most farmers lived in a barter-based world, trading surplus grain for tools or oil. By demanding payment in specific Roman currency, the empire forced the peasantry into the marketplace at the worst possible time, immediately after the harvest when grain prices were at their lowest due to oversupply. The logistics of this conversion were predatory. The farmer had to sell his grain to urban merchants or tax farmers, *publicani*, who controlled the local markets. These middlemen, backed by the authority of the Roman state, could manipulate prices buying the grain for a fraction of its value. The farmer would walk away with just enough silver to pay the Roman tribute, but with nothing left to cover his own operating costs or the mandatory religious tithes required by the temple in Jerusalem. When we add the Praetoria, the customs duties and tolls applied every time a farmer moved goods across administrative borders or into a city, the total effective tax rate for a Judean peasant often fluctuated between 30% and 40%. In a subsistence model where the surplus is rarely higher than 20%, this created a structural deficit of at least 10% every year. This deficit had to be financed. The only way to survive until the next harvest was to borrow. The lenders were not distant banks, but the very elites who benefited from the Roman system, the Herodian aristocracy and the high priestly families in Jerusalem. They provided the silver, but they secured the loans against the only collateral the farmer had left, his ancestral land. This was the start of the Great Consolidation, a period where the traditional map of Judea was erased and replaced by massive, commercial estates owned by absentee landlords. To understand the first-century economy, we must stop viewing the temple in Jerusalem solely as a religious site and begin viewing it as a sophisticated financial institution. In the Roman world, temples were the safest places to store wealth, and the Jerusalem temple was the most significant central bank in the Levant. It operated a dual-track financial system that was both an extraction point and a massive repository of capital. Every adult Jewish male across the Roman Empire was required to pay the annual half-shekel tax. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a massive cross-border transfer of hard currency from the diaspora into the temple treasury. However, there was a technical catch that served as a profit-generating mechanism. The temple authorities only accepted the Tyrian shekel for this payment. The Tyrian shekel was famous for its high silver purity, roughly 94%, while the standard Roman denarii and local provincial coins were increasingly debased. This requirement created an immediate demand for currency exchange. The money changers positioned in the temple courts were not merely providing a service. They were currency brokers managing the spread between debased local tender and the high-purity silver required for religious obligations. These brokers likely charged a fee, known as the kalibos, which functioned as a transaction tax on top of the religious tax itself. This ensured that even the act of worship generated a liquid surplus for the priestly elite. Furthermore, the temple served as a depository for the private wealth of the Judean aristocracy. In an era without digital ledgers, the temple's massive stone vaults were the only place where the wealthy could store their silver and, more importantly, their debt records. This made the temple the administrative heart of the creditor class. By controlling the purity of the currency and the archives of debt, the temple hierarchy effectively controlled the liquidity of the entire province. When we calculate the volume of the half-shekel tax from millions of Jewish people across the empire, combined with the voluntary offerings and the fees from the sacrificial markets, the temple emerges as a massive capital sink, a place where wealth entered but rarely circulated back down to the rural peasantry. While the temple managed the financial flow, the Herodian dynasty was busy re-engineering the physical landscape of Galilee to facilitate Roman-style extraction. The construction of cities like Sepphoris and Tiberias under Herod Antipas was not an act of civic benevolence. It was a strategic infrastructure project designed to centralize agricultural wealth. These new cities acted as collection hubs. Before their construction, the Galilean economy was decentralized, with small villages trading locally. After their construction, the rural hinterland was forced into a hub-and-spoke model. The cities required massive amounts of food to sustain their non-producing populations of administrators, soldiers, and elite families. This forced a radical shift in farming techniques. Farmers were pressured to abandon subsistence polyculture, growing a variety of crops for their own survival, and move toward commercial monoculture. This meant planting vast tracts of olives and grapes for the production of oil and wine, which were high-value export goods that could be taxed easily by the urban administration. This transition made the peasantry structurally vulnerable. If a farmer only grows wheat and the crop fails, he starves. But if a farmer is forced to grow only grapes for a commercial market, and the price of wine drops or the Roman trade routes are disrupted, He loses the ability to buy the food he no longer grows. The cost of building these marble-clad cities was also passed down through increased local levies. The labor for these massive projects often came from corvée labor, forced, unpaid work periods required of the peasantry. This took men away from their own fields during critical times in the agricultural calendar, further reducing their yields and driving them deeper into the debt cycle we identified earlier. We are seeing the urbanization of poverty. The wealth of the countryside was being physically moved into the cities in the form of stone, luxury, and silver, leaving the rural population with nothing but the soil and an increasing pile of debt contracts. The infrastructure of the Herodian cities was the physical manifestation of the extraction machine, a visible sign that the old ways of family-owned, subsistence land were being replaced by a corporate, state-driven model of production. The inevitable result of the tax and debt machine was the creation of a new, desperate social class, the landless day laborer, or misthotos. For a Jewish family in the first century, losing your land was more than a financial disaster. It was a theological and social death. The land was their patrimony, a gift from the divine that was supposed to stay within the family forever. By the middle of the first century, the structural pressure had reached a breaking point, and thousands of families were being foreclosed upon. These former landowners didn't disappear. They became disposable labor. In the Roman economic hierarchy, a slave was a capital asset. The owner had a financial incentive to keep the slave alive and healthy. But a day laborer was an operating expense. If a day laborer died or became injured, the estate owner could simply hire another from the crowd standing in the village square every morning. This is the brutal reality behind many of the parables of the era. The image of men standing all day waiting for someone to hire them for a single denarius. A single denarius was the standard daily wage, and in the high inflation environment of Roman Judea, it was barely enough to provide the 2,500 calories needed for a working man and his family. There was no margin for error. If it rained and the work stopped, the family didn't eat. This created a permanent state of food insecurity. Many of these landless men, having lost their stake in the social order, fled to the hills. Roman historians and the local elite called them bandits or robbers, but modern economic analysis suggests they were actually social bandits, displaced workers who turned to low-level insurgency and theft as a form of survival and protest against the debt system. This landless class became the tinder for the coming revolution. They were the ones with nothing left to lose, whose debt records were stored in the temple they could no longer afford to support. The transformation of a stable class of smallholders into a volatile proletariat of day laborers and insurgents was the final sign that the Judean economy had moved from extraction to self-destruction. The system was no longer just taking the surplus. It was consuming the producers themselves. The structural instability of the Judean economy was further exacerbated by a factor often overlooked in purely religious histories: the technical manipulation of the currency itself. In the Roman world, a coin was not merely a medium of exchange. It was a physical weight of precious metal that served as the final anchor of value. However, the Roman central administration discovered that it could effectively manufacture wealth by reducing the silver content of the denarius, a process known as debasement. While the most aggressive debasements occurred slightly later under Nero, the trend of metallurgical dilution was already a creeping reality in the first century. For the Galilean farmer, this created a devastating invisible tax. When the silver purity of the currency drops, the price of essential commodities like wheat, oil, and tools rises to compensate for the lower value of the metal. This is the ancient version of inflation, and it disproportionately attacked the poor. Because the farmer's tax obligation to Rome was often fixed in nominal amounts, a certain number of denarii, the fact that those denarii could now buy less bread didn't reduce his debt. In fact, it made his operational costs skyrocket. The spread between the imperial denarius and the high-purity Tyrian shekel used in the temple created a localized currency crisis. As the denarius became less reliable, the cost of acquiring the temple silver required for religious taxes became higher. The money changers were the only ones equipped to navigate this volatility, and they extracted a premium for the risk. This meant that the real-world cost of a religious tithe was constantly fluctuating, usually to the disadvantage of the person least able to afford it. We must also consider the velocity of money in this environment. In the wealthy urban centers of Sepphoris and Jerusalem, silver circulated rapidly, fueling luxury construction and trade. But in the rural villages, silver was a rare and terrifying object. It only appeared during tax season or when a loan was being signed. The lack of small change or low-value copper coinage in rural areas meant that peasants were often forced to round up their payments, losing even more value in the transaction. This was a system where the very math of the money was rigged against the producer. The technical failure of the currency to maintain its value, combined with the rigid demands of the tax collectors, acted as a hydraulic press, slowly crushing the last remaining margins of the Galilean middle class. Every economic system pushed beyond its mathematical limits eventually seeks a reset, and in the year 66 AD, Roman Judea found its reset through total systemic violence. While history books record the start of the Great Jewish Revolt as a religious and nationalistic uprising, the first tactical move of the rebels reveals the true underlying grievance. Upon seizing control of Jerusalem, the very first building the revolutionary forces targeted was not the Roman garrison at the Antonia fortress, but the public archive. They didn't go there for weapons or gold. They went there to burn the debt records. This was a hostile liquidation of the province's financial liabilities. By destroying the archives, the revolutionaries were performing a forced debt jubilee. They were physically erasing the legal framework that had allowed the urban elite to seize rural land over the previous century. This act demonstrates that the conflict was, at its core, a class war disguised as a holy war. The people who burned the archives were the landless day laborers and the bandits we discussed earlier, the victims of the foreclosure loop. The burning of the debt records was a rational economic response to an irrational economic burden. For the insurgents, the Roman legal system and the temple administration had become nothing more than the enforcement arm of the creditors. By incinerating the scrolls, they effectively restored the patrimony of the people, at least in their own eyes. This act of financial sabotage completely decapitated the Judean economy. Without records, the aristocratic families had no legal claim to the interest they were owed or the land they had seized. The liquidity of the temple's central bank evaporated instantly as the social contract underlying the debt was shredded. However, Rome's response was not dictated by theology, but by the necessity of restoring the extraction machine. Rome could not allow a province to simply delete its debts, as this would set a dangerous precedent for the rest of the empire. The subsequent 4-year war, ending in the total destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD, was the ultimate foreclosure by the state. When the debt could not be paid in silver, it was paid in blood and territory. The destruction of the temple was the final, violent closure of the Judean accounts, proving that the system would rather destroy its own infrastructure than allow a jubilee that favored the producer over the creditor. When we synthesize the data points of first-century Judea, a clear pattern of systemic collapse emerges. This was not a society that failed because of a lack of faith or a simple military defeat. It was a society that was mathematically engineered into a corner. The interaction between Roman imperial taxation, the rigid religious tithe system, and the predatory lending practices of the urban elite created a triple extraction that exceeded the biological capacity of the land. In an agrarian economy, the surplus generated by a farm must first cover the survival of the workers, then the replacement of tools and seeds, and only then can it be taxed. By 66 AD, the extraction had moved deep into the survival layer. The system was eating its own foundation. The conversion of a diverse, subsistence-based peasantry into a monocultural, debt-ridden proletariat made the entire region fragile. A single bad harvest or a minor increase in the price of silver was no longer a manageable hardship. It was a terminal event for thousands of families. The inevitability of the catastrophe lies in the fact that none of the players could afford to stop. Rome needed the tribute to maintain the Pax Romana. The temple needed the tithes to maintain its status as the cosmic center of the world, and the Herodian elite needed the land to secure their own power within the Roman hierarchy. No one was looking at the aggregate numbers. No one was calculating the total caloric deficit being imposed on the Galilean villages. The ministry of Jesus and the subsequent rise of messianic movements were the social steam escaping from an overheated engine. These movements provided an ideological framework for a population that had been structurally discarded by the economy. The total destruction of 70 AD was the logical conclusion of an extraction machine that had no off switch. When the math of survival no longer adds up, the only remaining options are revolution or extinction. Judea experienced both. We must view this period not just as a religious turning point, but as a case study in what happens when infrastructure and finance are weaponized against the very people who sustain them. The history of first-century Roman Judea is often taught through the lens of individual choices and divine intervention, but a forensic examination of the numbers reveals a different story. It reveals a story of a system that had no choice but to break. When the combined tax burden of a centralized imperial state and a traditional religious hierarchy consistently exceeds the caloric surplus of the land, the result is always systemic displacement. The parables found in ancient texts from this era aren't just spiritual metaphors. They're technical field reports from an economic disaster zone. The day laborers standing in the village markets, the debtors being dragged into local courts, and the bandits hiding in the Judean hills were the logical, mathematical outputs of a high-extraction financial machine. Rome didn't destroy Judea because of a simple clash of gods. It destroyed Judea because the province had stopped functioning as a reliable, liquid revenue stream. The War of 70 AD was the final, brutal audit of a bankrupt society. As we have seen throughout this investigation, the infrastructure of debt and the engineering of urban centers like Tiberias were not built to serve the local peasantry, but to funnel their very survival into the vaults of a tiny urban elite. This is the core lesson of structural history. Systems behave this way because they are designed to prioritize their own maintenance and growth over the lives of the individuals within them. When the friction between extraction and survival becomes too great, the system enters a feedback loop of violence and collapse. If you found this structural breakdown of ancient history insightful and want to see more investigations into the hidden mechanics of power and money, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Your engagement is what fuels our ability to continue digging into the data and infrastructure that traditional narratives often ignore. By following the silver and the soil, we find a true engine of human history. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.